Hello, and welcome to the Why We Argue podcast. I'm Robert Talisse, your host. I am professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University. Why We Argue is produced by Humility and Conviction in Public Life, a project based at the University of Connecticut, which explores how to balance our deepest commitments with open-mindedness, a respect for reason, and intellectual humility. The series, which is made possible by generous funding from the John Templeton Foundation, features brief discussions with publicly minded thinkers about the state of civil discourse in contemporary democracy. Today, my guest is Helene Landemore. Helene is associate professor in the political science department at Yale University. She works primarily in democratic theory and is particularly interested in collective wisdom. That is, she works on the conditions under which large groups of non-experts can outperform experts. In her recent book, which is titled Democratic Reason, published by Princeton University Press in 2013, Helene makes the case that a properly designed democracy harnesses the collective intelligence of the people, and that makes democracy smart. Helene is currently completing a new book about what she calls open democracy, and this book specifies the institutional design of a smart democracy. Hello, Helene.
Hello, Bob.
How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you.
Well, thanks for joining me on the Why We Argue podcast. So let's get to it. As you know, and I suspect as many listeners will know, at least since Plato, democracy has been criticized on the grounds that it places political power in the hands of the foolish many. And this classical objection has gained some traction of late, or maybe some new traction of late. There are many who think that contemporary democracies have been making unwise decisions. Now, Helene, you've defended democracy, in theory at least, on the grounds that it can be wise. That is, you've tried to take on the Platonic objection straightforwardly. So let's begin there. Can you explain your view about the wisdom of democratic groups?
Right. So in my work, I look at a sort of idealized version of democracy, the model of democracy, where democracy is defined as an inclusive decision procedure, right? And the main argument basically is to say that to the extent that we make decisions through deliberation, and deliberation is a way for us to solve collective problems and try to figure out the best answer to our collective problems, the more people we include in that conversation, that exchange of arguments, the more likely we are to figure out the truth or the best arguments or the relevant information and ultimately do what's best for the community. So that's an argument from numbers in a way, because numbers serve as a proxy for the cognitive diversity that's needed to solve problems. And the more people you include, the more you tap this cognitive diversity that's spread across the entirety of the citizen body. And by contrast, when you restrict decision making about the common good to a small number of people, generally a socioeconomic elite of people trained in the same schools with the same sort of life experience, you considerably restrict the diversity of input, of perspectives, of approaches to a given problem, and you are less likely ex ante and on the long term to sort of make the right decision. So that's the sort of argument.
And it's not only am I right in thinking that it's not only an argument about numbers, it's also an argument about, as you were just suggesting, cognitive diversity?
That's correct, but I say numbers because for me, including everyone is the sort of easiest, cheapest way to get at the cognitive diversity that's characteristic of a large group. And the why it's cheaper is because you could also try to oversample cognitive minorities along lines that seem relevant for a given set of issues, but it's much harder to do, and in part because we don't know what the problems are going to be. It could be an economic crisis, it could be an environmental crisis, it could be the issue of the losers of globalization, and so for all these questions as a package, you cannot know in advance who will have the right answers, and you need the perspective of everyone, students, that are saddled with debts, and you need the perspective, of course, of experts and economists, but you also need a diversity of views on the problem from all possible angles. That's the only way to get at the full picture of the problem you are dealing with, in my view.
Right. So then it seems that if some given democratic society's practices are aimed at further segregating cognitive resources, then, and by that I mean a news and political environment in which citizens are increasingly encouraged to silo off into more homogeneous groupings and to discuss political matters with people who are increasingly more like themselves, then this, I take it on your view, would be something very, very bad.
Yes, it's very bad. It's a problem of these bubbles, these silos that cause us to ignore an entire aspect of reality. And I think that's what happened to the left in this country. I think they completely missed the question that sort of the central worry of the Trump electorate, for example, the losers of globalization. But that was actually true of the sort of elite left and elite right. In a way, Trump came as an outsider that brought to the fore this question that was ignored by both parties, because both parties were very committed to globalization and its benefits and its sort of net benefits, but nobody was paying attention to a question that was the question of a minority whose views were not represented in the media, whose views were not aired at all. So they were not part of the conversation, and that's part of the reason why all of us got so surprised.
Good.
And you might say the same thing happened with Brexit, right? There was a sort of consensus on the left and partly on the right, certain right, that more globalization was better. More free trade is always better on average, and that's a view that couldn't be questioned. And after those election results and this referendum, now we're realizing we should have discussed those questions.
So what do you think? Right. So what do you think about what measures can we take? It's often thought that the kind of diversity that you're arguing democracy needs in order to wisely address its problems, it's often thought that diversity is something to be tolerated or something to be begrudgingly accepted, that everyone has a place in the conversation, or everyone has a right to share his or her experience or raise his or her concerns, is frequently seen as something that we owe to other people, but we tolerate those other voices merely as a way of treating them well. Your view is though that we all benefit from cognitive diversity. How can we foster that, or do you have any ideas about how we can change our practice?
Well, it demands a lot of changes, I think. It demands to change partly our understanding of what democracy is about. It also demands trying to understand how deliberation works. Because my view is that deliberation is a sort of technology, really, and that we barely know how to handle it. And for a while, we thought that the point was to get to a consensus, for example. So we probably overemphasized the necessity of converging on a common conclusion, which had, I think, has bad effects in terms of stifling dissent. And as you say, we tolerate dissent because we, out of respect for participants. But I think it's a very important reason. But it's even more, to me, it's even deeper than that. Meaning it's instrumentally vital to the quality of the conclusions we're likely to reach as a group. We need dissenters, and we need a plurality of views and conflicting views, and what I call what my co-author and I, Scott Page and I, call positive dissensus, right? Like things that are actually constructively contributing to the group reaching better conclusions. It demands, I think there's a lot more research to be done about the conditions under which deliberation works, whether we need more transparency to outsiders, whether, how do we implement a genuine equality between the participants? Does it mean that they need to have the same amount of airtime, or does it mean something else? It demands also answering questions about the role of emotions, and how do we deal with people who are who engage in arguments in a passionate way rather than this rational sort of dispassionate tone that we tend to privilege. So there are lots of questions that we don't really know the answer to, and I think it's, for me, it's the medieval stage at which we are. It's well represented by the presidential debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, in a way. I mean, we expect that putting those two people on a stage with a live public is going to yield epistemically satisfying results. And of course, it's not what happens, because what happens is that they basically only speak to their audience. They dog whistle to a subset of the public. They use code words. They evade questions. And so in fact, the amount of information and arguments generated is very low. And so I don't think we should organize our public debates that way. I think it's more spectacle than deliberation to me.
Do you think that there's a worry that contemporary democracy, with all of the new communicative abilities that we have at present, social media, 24/7 news channels, the ability to tweet at the president or to the president of the country. Do you think that there's some danger, as you were just saying, that the technology has sort of outpaced our understanding of how to harness its democratic potential?
Yeah, I actually think that. I'm all for Facebook, Twitter, all these. I think all these tools are amazing if we knew how to use them well, but because you're able to put out thoughts that you would lose otherwise, and they're there forever, and they can be reused and documented, and so it's very useful. It's like we're basically putting outside in the world our brains, really, and all the thoughts that are produced on a daily basis, on a minute per minute basis. But on the other hand, how do we make sure there's an actual conversation between all those thoughts, rather than just what we call enclave deliberation among like-minded people, which lead to more polarization and less understanding of what's really happening in the world? So I think that it's so far technology has outpaced our understanding of what's needed to conduct good deliberation. I mean, although it's not entirely true, we do have some theories about what makes for good deliberation. It's just that it's not implemented. There are some experiments here and there, and mini publics and citizens' assemblies, but it's still at a very experimental level, and it's not been given as much visibility, at least in the media and at the level of national governments, as probably they should have been.
So that's very helpful, because sometimes when a political philosopher says something so bold as democracies can be wise, and the group of non-experts can outperform the experts, sometimes that's heard as a very optimistic view about actual existing democratic practices. And we're now, as you're describing it, we're now seeing that your view is about a perhaps implementable ideal. It's not a vindication of actual democracies.
Yes, that's right. I think it's my view is probably that I'm not sure we've seen a real democracy since ancient Athens, bracketing the exclusionary aspects of that ancient democracy. The fact that women and domestics and slaves were excluded, but it was truly a democracy based on deliberation and the rule of ordinary citizens. People were exercising power on a daily basis. They were not just consenting to power every 4 years. So I feel like indeed, I mean, I make predictions about the wisdom of a democracy, but the democracy I have in mind would look very different from the ones we know. The systems we call democracies, but that are, in fact, electoral oligarchies or representative governments, however you want to call them, but the regimes in which ordinary citizens consent to power but do not really exercise it. And I think if ordinary citizens were to exercise power again, not in the direct ways of ancient democracy, but in more mediated ways, and were given a say, upstream of all the decisions, midstream, downstream, at many different levels, I think we would see very different results. But it's a theory.
Right. So let's turn then to some of the more recent work that you've been doing. So I know from just following your work that you've been very interested in some experiments with democracy and constitution making in Iceland. Can you tell us a little bit about your interest in that, and maybe just tell us a little bit about what's happened in Iceland?
Right. So Iceland is a good example of what I'm now calling open democracy, a sort of emerging form of actual democracy that looks more like what I have in mind when I talk about democracy. And what happened there, it's in 2008, the country collapsed. They burned 7 times their GDP. They had a so-called pots and pans revolution where they kicked out their sitting parliament. And then they decided that they would write a new constitution for the country. And they did so in a very unprecedented way. They decided that it would be maximally inclusive. So the 3 sort of characteristics that made this process unprecedented, in my view, is that they had first, upstream of the process, a national forum of about 1,000 people that were randomly selected from the larger population, that were given the task to define the values and principles that were going to go into the text, into the constitutional text. So they did that. Then the second step was the election of an assembly of drafters. So they chose 25 drafters from a pool of about 500 people that were themselves a pool that excluded professional politicians. So the goal was to empower ordinary citizens. And the third aspect of that process that to me was really radically new is that those 25, instead of locking themselves up in a room and writing in secrecy this new social contract, they in fact decided to use the social media and the new digital tools to open up the process to the larger public. So they put online 12 drafts at various stages of completion, and they integrated the feedback of the people who participated. So those 3 aspects, I think, are extremely new, and they correspond to this idea of empowering ordinary citizens, giving them a say, not just at the end when it's too late to change anything, but really early on in the process, at the very beginning. And in fact, throughout. So it's democracy at the beginning, democracy at the end, democracy throughout, democracy kind of always. Of course, this experiment has its limitations. It wasn't conclusive in the end. The parliament, decided not to vote on the constitutional proposal, etc. And it's a small country, and not a great number of people participated in the crowdsourcing phase. But still, it's a sort of first experiment in a more genuinely democratic and open form of decision making on something that seems very fundamental and usually left to experts, namely constitution making. So this gives me hope that we could do something similar for ordinary legislation, for perhaps all sorts of policy making decisions, meaning involving people earlier in the process, throughout the process, and via these new forms of participation like random selection or crowdsourcing. So that's what happened.
Can you? Why did the Icelandic Parliament not bring the constitutional revisions to a vote?
So there are multiple, interpretations of what happened. One is that the Parliament at the time, when it received this new constitutional proposal, had vested interests against the content. For example, one of the very controversial article of that constitution was Article 34, which nationalized all natural resources that were not already privately owned. So basically, it was a lot of fishing grounds. And that was, of course, very, this was not to the benefit of the sort of oligarchs of Iceland who made a lot of money in the 80s and 90s exploiting those natural resources for free. So they were not willing to let go of that sort of, advantage. And so that's one reason that's been advanced. Other people say, well, it's just that, at that point, the crisis had been sort of had faded in the background. The economy was back to normal. So people didn't see the point of changing the constitution so much. There had been some procedural issues during the constitutional process. For example, the Supreme Court had struck down the elections to the Constitutional Assembly. So basically, there were some issues of legitimacy that were played up, and so there are all sorts of reasons. My own take is that it's a usual story of the powers that be that don't really want to relinquish power. It would have demanded of Parliament that it basically committed suicide, be replaced by a new Parliament that would have had to approve the new constitutional proposal as well. I don't think it proves that the process was bound to fail. I think it just proves that there are hurdles and that you need to strategize a little bit about how to convince the powers that be to let go of power. Really, it's not easy.
Right. So we can't get around politics in a certain sense, maybe.
That's the thing, right?
So
the transition from here to there, it's always the most difficult question.
So you've been very generous with your time, Helene. So let me just ask as a final question, given where we just got to, do you have any thoughts, any advice, or any thoughts about how we might move forward to given existing conditions, perhaps especially existing conditions in the United States, to work to more fully realize a better democratic ideal?
Well, so I trust that there are some, experiments done at the city level across the U.S. I think things are changing very slowly. But on a personal, individual level, I think we need to work on our understanding of what it means to listen to other people and understand them, and we need to learn to respect, cognitive diversity and differences of opinion. And it's not what I'm seeing on Facebook or all these other platforms. Actually, I'm sort of reluctant to engage in those debates because all I see is that people who post, opinions and then expect people to chime in agreement and and if you don't say something that concurs, then nobody likes you or you're ignored. So I don't think that's the right attitude. There should be more welcoming of dissent and more, less valorization of consensus. That's my sense.
Well, that sounds like a good point on which to end. Helene, thank you so much for joining me today on the Why We Argue podcast. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to the Why We Argue podcast, which I remind you is produced by the University of Connecticut's Humility and Conviction in Public Life project with generous support from the John Templeton Foundation. You can follow the project on Twitter and on Facebook at Public Humility. That's one word, Public Humility. Thank you so much, and bye for now.